The blood was still warm on her porch when Willa Preston found what remained of Scout, her 3-year-old shepherd mix, who had been her constant companion since she had arrived in Leadville, Colorado, 2 years ago. She dropped to her knees on the wooden planks, her scream cutting through the thin mountain air of that September morning in 1882, a sound so raw and primal that it sent birds scattering from the pine trees that surrounded her small property at the edge of town. The note pinned to Scout's collar with a rusted nail was brief and brutal. "Leave town or you're next." Willa had known this was coming. She had felt it building like a summer storm over the Rockies ever since she had refused to sell her land to Marcus Thornwood and his mining operation 3 months ago. Her late husband, Daniel, had staked this claim 5 years earlier, and when he had died in a cave collapse at one of Thornwood's other mines 2 years back, Willa had inherited not just the land, but also the knowledge that beneath her modest acreage lay a rich vein of silver that Thornwood desperately wanted. She had already sold the mining rights to a smaller, more ethical operation run by a group of former miners who treated their workers fairly, and that decision had made her an enemy of the most powerful man in Leadville. She buried Scout behind the house, near the small vegetable garden she had planted that spring, her hands blistering as she dug through the rocky soil. Tears streamed down her face, leaving tracks through the dust that seemed to coat everything at this altitude. She was 24 years old, a widow, and now she had lost the one living creature who had made her feel less alone in this harsh mountain town. As she patted down the last of the dirt over Scout's grave, she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Willa looked up, one hand instinctively moving to the rifle she had propped against the side of the house. But the man who rode into her yard did not have the look of one of Thornwood's thugs. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture relaxed but alert, and even from a distance, she could see the easy confidence of someone completely at home on horseback. He wore a dark brown hat, a worn leather vest over a blue cotton shirt, and his face was sun-bronzed and handsome in a rough, weathered way that spoke of years spent outdoors. As he drew closer, she noticed his eyes were a striking gray-green, the color of sage after rain. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat as he brought his horse to a stop a respectful distance from where she stood. "I heard the scream from down the road. Everything all right?" Willa almost laughed at the absurdity of the question, but the genuine concern in his voice stopped her. "Do I look like everything is all right?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. He dismounted in one fluid motion and took a few steps closer, his gaze moving from her tear-stained face to the freshly turned earth at her feet, then to the bloodstains on the porch. His jaw tightened. "Your dog?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Who did this?" His voice had gone cold, and she noticed his hand had moved closer to the revolver at his hip. "Marcus Thornwood," she said. "Or more likely, one of his men. They want my land. This was their way of telling me to leave." The stranger's eyes narrowed. "Thornwood, I have heard that name since I rode into town yesterday. None of what I have heard has been good." "And who are you?" Willa asked, suddenly aware that she was alone with a man she did not know, miles from the nearest neighbor. "Ethan Ortega," he said, extending his hand. "I have been working cattle drives from Texas up through Colorado for the past 8 years. I came to Leadville looking for my brother Miguel. He wrote me 6 months ago saying he had found work at one of the mines here, but I have not heard from him since." Willa shook his hand, noting the calluses and the strength in his grip. "Willa Preston," she said, "I am sorry about your brother. A lot of miners have died in these mountains. The work is dangerous, and some operations care more about silver than they do about the men who dig it out of the ground." Ethan's expression darkened. "Miguel knew mining. Our father worked silver mines in Mexico before we came north. Miguel would not have taken foolish risks." "It is not always about risks," Willa said quietly. "Sometimes the mine owners cut corners on safety. Sometimes accidents are not really accidents." She saw understanding dawn in Ethan's eyes. Thornwood, he said. Maybe. I do not know, but he owns half the mines in this area, and he has a reputation for running them cheap and dirty. Willa wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the September sun. I should not be telling you this. I should not be talking to strangers about Thornwood. That is probably how I ended up with a dead dog on my porch. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and she had the strange feeling that he was seeing past her defenses, past the hard shell she had built around herself since Daniel's death. You should not be out here alone, he said finally. Not if Thornwood is threatening you. I do not have much choice, Willa said. This is my home. This is all I have. Then let me stay, Ethan said. Just for a few days until I can figure out what happened to Miguel. I can sleep in your barn, help out around the property. Extra hands and an extra gun might make Thornwood's men think twice about coming back. Willa wanted to say no. She wanted to tell this stranger to ride on and leave her to handle her problems alone, the way she had been handling everything alone since Daniel died. But she was tired and she was scared, and there was something about Ethan Ortega that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she did not have to face everything by herself. All right, she said, but just for a few days. And you stay in the barn. Ethan nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. Yes, madam. Over the next 2 days, Ethan proved himself to be a man of his word. He repaired the broken fence rail along the north side of her property, replaced several loose boards on the barn roof, and chopped enough firewood to last her through the winter. Willa found herself watching him work, admiring the easy efficiency of his movements and the way he seemed to approach every task with the same focused attention. He did not talk much, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and deliberate. On the third morning, Willa woke to find Ethan already up, boiling coffee over the fire pit outside the barn. She walked over, wrapping her shawl tighter against the early morning chill that came with living at 10,000 feet above sea level. Could not sleep? She asked. He poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her. I am used to being up before dawn. Old habit from years of cattle drives. Willa sipped the coffee, strong and black the way she liked it. Have you learned anything about your brother? Ethan's expression clouded. I went into town yesterday afternoon, asked around at some of the saloons. A few people remembered Miguel. He was working at the Silver Bell mine, one of Thornwood's operations up in the hills west of here. There was a collapse in April. 5 men died. Miguel was one of them. I am so sorry, Willa said, and she meant it. She knew the hollow ache of sudden loss, the way it carved out a space inside you that never quite filled in again. The thing is, Ethan continued, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, the people I talked to said that collapse should never have happened. They said Thornwood had been warned about the instability of that shaft, but he refused to pay for proper shoring. He wanted the silver out fast, and he did not care about the risk. Willa set down her coffee cup. That sounds like Thornwood. One of the men I spoke with said something else, Ethan said. He said Miguel had been talking about going to the territorial authorities about reporting Thornwood for unsafe practices. He said Miguel was trying to organize the other miners, get them to demand better conditions. A week later, the shaft collapsed. The implication hung in the air between them. Willa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain morning. You think Thornwood had something to do with it? I think my brother was murdered, Ethan said flatly. And I think Thornwood is responsible. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of that accusation settling over them. Finally, Willa spoke. What are you going to do? I am going to prove it, Ethan said. And then I am going to make sure Marcus Thornwood answers for what he has done. That is dangerous talk, Willa said. Thornwood has the sheriff in his pocket. He has a dozen armed men working for him. He owns this town. Then maybe it is time someone reminded him that he does not own everything, Ethan said. His eyes met hers, and she saw the steel in them. The core of determination that she suspected ran all the way through him. And maybe we start by making sure you do not lose your land. Later that afternoon, they rode into Leadville together. The town sprawled across the valley at the headwaters of the Arkansas River, a chaotic jumble of buildings that had sprung up almost overnight when silver was discovered in 1877. In just 5 years, Leadville had grown from a handful of cabins to a population of 15,000, making it the second largest city in Colorado after Denver. The main street, Harrison Avenue, was a mix of elegant brick buildings and rough wooden structures, testimony to the town's rapid and uneven growth. They stopped first at the land office, where Willa wanted to make sure her deed was properly recorded and filed. The clerk, a nervous man named Peter Simmons, assured her that everything was in order, but Willa noticed the way his hands shook as he pulled out her papers, and the way he kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. "Has Thornwood been here?" Willa asked bluntly. Simmons went pale. "I cannot talk about other people's business, Mrs. Preston." "That means yes," Ethan said. He leaned against the counter, his posture casual, but his eyes sharp. What did he want to know? "Please," Simmons whispered. "I have a family. I cannot afford to make trouble with Marcus Thornwood." Willa felt a surge of anger. This was what Thornwood did, she realized. He did not just threaten and intimidate individuals. He created an atmosphere of fear that infected the whole town, making everyone complicit in their own oppression. But before she could say anything, Ethan spoke. "How much is Thornwood paying you?" he asked. Simmons blinked. "What?" "How much is he paying you to let him know whenever someone files a claim he might be interested in, or whenever someone comes asking questions about land he wants?" Ethan's voice was calm, almost conversational. "I am guessing it is not much, maybe a few dollars a month, just enough to make it feel worth the risk." Simmons did not deny it, which was answer enough. "Here is a better offer," Ethan said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He counted out 10 silver dollars and placed them on the counter. "That is for telling us everything Thornwood has asked you about Mrs. Preston's land, and for letting us know if he comes back asking more questions." Simmons stared at the money, then at Ethan, then at Willa. She could see the internal struggle playing out across his face, fear warring with greed, and maybe, just maybe, a small spark of decency. Finally, he scooped up the coins and leaned forward. "Thornwood has been here 3 times in the past month," he said in a low voice. "He wanted to know if there were any liens on Mrs. Preston's property, any debts that might force a sale. He also asked about the mineral rights, wanted to know who she had sold them to. I told him about the Harrison Mining Cooperative. That is the group of former miners I made the deal with," Willa explained to Ethan. "They are honest men, and they are paying me a fair percentage." "Thornwood was not happy about that," Simmons continued. "He said the cooperative was undercutting his prices and treating workers too well, making his own operations look bad by comparison. He said he was going to shut them down one way or another." Ethan and Willa exchanged glances. "Is there anything else?" Ethan asked. "Just that Thornwood said if Mrs. Preston would not sell voluntarily, there were other ways to make her leave." Simmons looked at Willa with something that might have been sympathy. "I am sorry, madam. I should have warned you, but I was afraid." "Thank you for telling us now," Willa said. She meant it, even though the information only confirmed what she had already known. They left the land office and walked down Harrison Avenue, past the elegant Tabor Opera House and the bustling shops and saloons that lined the street. Leadville was a town that never seemed to sleep, its population swollen with miners and speculators, and all the people who followed boom towns hoping to make their fortune. Willa had never felt at home here. Not really. It was too loud, too crowded, too full of desperate people willing to do anything for a glimpse of silver. "We should talk to the Harrison Mining Cooperative," Ethan said. "If Thornwood is threatening them too, maybe we can work together." Willa nodded. The cooperative's office was on the western edge of town, a modest wooden building that also served as a boarding house for some of the miners. They found James Harrison, the group's leader, in the small front room that served as his office. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a weathered face and kind eyes, and he stood up immediately when he saw Willa. "Mrs. Preston," he said, "I heard about your dog. I am so sorry." "How did you hear?" Willa asked. "News travels fast in a town this size," Harrison said, "especially when it involves Marcus Thornwood." He turned to Ethan. "I do not believe we have met." Ethan introduced himself and explained about his brother. Harrison's expression grew somber. "I remember Miguel Ortega. Good man, hard worker. He was one of the ones pushing for better safety standards across all the mines. His death was a real loss." "It was murder," Ethan said flatly. Harrison did not disagree. "I cannot prove it, but I have my suspicions. Thornwood has a way of removing obstacles." "We heard he is targeting the cooperative too," Willa said. Harrison sat down heavily in his chair. "He is doing more than targeting us. 2 weeks ago, someone sabotaged our main shaft. We lost a week of work while we repaired it. Last week, 3 of our investors backed out, said they had received threats. Thornwood is trying to strangle us financially while also making it impossible for us to operate safely. If he succeeds in shutting us down, you will lose your income from the mineral rights, Mrs. Preston, and without that income, you will not be able to hold on to your land." Willa felt the trap closing around her. Thornwood had not just made one move against her. He had orchestrated a whole campaign, attacking her from multiple angles, ensuring that even if she was brave enough to stand up to threats and intimidation, she would eventually be forced out by simple economic necessity. "There has to be something we can do," she said. "We could go to the territorial authorities," Harrison suggested, but he did not sound hopeful. "File formal complaints about Thornwood's business practices." "That will take months, maybe years," Ethan said, "and Thornwood will use that time to destroy the cooperative and force Mrs. Preston off her land." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant as if working through a problem. Then he looked at Harrison. "What if Thornwood's operations suffered the same kind of setbacks he has been inflicting on you?" Harrison's eyes widened. "That is dangerous thinking, son." "I am not talking about hurting anyone," Ethan said, "but Thornwood has a dozen different operations running in these mountains. If some of them were to experience delays, equipment failures, small accidents that cost him time and money, it might distract him from his campaign against the cooperative and Mrs. Preston. It might also hurt him enough financially that he would have to pull back." "You are talking about sabotage," Harrison said slowly. "I'm talking about evening the odds," Ethan replied. Willa looked at Ethan, seeing him in a new light. He was not just a cowboy looking for answers about his brother. He was a man who understood strategy, who could think several moves ahead. And more than that, he was someone willing to take risks to protect people he cared about. The realization that she was one of those people sent a strange warmth through her chest. "I am in," she said. Both men turned to look at her. "Mrs. Preston," Harrison began, "this is not something a lady should be involved in." "Do not tell me what a lady should or should not do," Willa said sharply. "Thornwood killed my dog. He is trying to steal my land. And if what we suspect is true, he murdered my husband and Ethan's brother. I have more reason than anyone to want to hurt him." Ethan studied her face, and she met his gaze without flinching. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but we do this smart and we do this careful. Thornwood cannot know we are behind it." Over the next 2 weeks, they put their plan into action. Ethan scouted Thornwood's various operations, learning their schedules and routines. He discovered that Thornwood was overextended, running so many mines and processing facilities that he could not properly supervise them all. Security was lax, especially at the more remote locations. They started small. A wagon wheel loosened here, causing a delay in ore transport. A piece of machinery gummed up with sand, requiring hours of cleaning. A false tip about a rich vein in the wrong direction, sending Thornwood's men on a week-long wild chase. None of it was enough to cause serious damage, but cumulatively, it began to cost Thornwood time and money. Willa found herself spending more and more time with Ethan, both working on their plans and simply being together. He taught her how to shoot better, taking her out to a secluded spot in the woods and patiently correcting her stance and her breathing until she could hit targets with a consistency that surprised her. She cooked for him, experimenting with recipes and enjoying the way his face lit up when he tasted something he particularly liked. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their lives, their losses, their dreams. She learned that Ethan had grown up in San Antonio, the son of a Mexican father and a Texas mother of mixed heritage. He and Miguel had left home when Ethan was 18, and Miguel was 20, seeking better opportunities than their father's small ranch could provide. They had worked cattle drives together for years before Miguel had decided to try his hand at mining. Ethan spoke about his brother with a mixture of love and regret, wishing he had convinced Miguel to stay with the cattle instead of chasing silver. Willa told him about Daniel, about how they had met in Denver when she was working as a school teacher and he had come to the city to file his mining claim. She had been swept up in his enthusiasm and his big dreams, and when he had asked her to marry him after knowing her for only 3 months, she had said yes. The reality of life in Leadville had been harder than either of them had expected, but they had been happy, or at least she had thought they were. After his death, she had discovered that Daniel had taken out several loans from Thornwood, loans she had known nothing about. She had paid them off using Daniel's life insurance and the money from the mineral rights deal, but the experience had left her wary and determined to never let anyone have that kind of financial power over her again. One evening, about 3 weeks after Ethan had first ridden into her yard, they were sitting on her porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The aspens were starting to turn gold, and the air had the crisp edge that meant winter was not far off. Ethan had been quiet all evening, and Willa sensed something was weighing on him. "What is wrong?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "I am falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I have been trying not to, because I know I have no right. I came here to find my brother, and when that is done, I should move on. But I cannot stop thinking about you, Willa. I cannot imagine leaving you." Willa felt tears prick her eyes. She had been trying to ignore her own growing feelings for Ethan, telling herself it was too soon after Daniel, that she barely knew this man, that opening her heart again was asking to be hurt. But the truth was that she had not felt this alive, this seen, since long before Daniel's death. Ethan looked at her like she was strong and capable and worth protecting all at once. He listened when she spoke and valued her opinions. He made her laugh and he made her feel safe, and somewhere along the way she had fallen in love with him too. "You have every right," she said, "and I feel the same way." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. His thumb traced circles on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. "I do not have much to offer you," he said. "I have saved some money from the cattle drives, but I am not a rich man. I cannot compete with land and silver." "I do not want you to compete," Willa said. "I want you to stay. I want you to be with me, to build a life together here. We can make the ranch work, maybe run cattle if the mining income is not enough. I do not need wealth, Ethan. I need someone who sees me as a partner, not as property." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, and the gesture was so tender that it made her heart ache. "I will stay as long as you will have me," he said. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They sat like that as the sun sank below the peaks and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, both of them understanding that they had made a commitment that went deeper than words. But their peace was short-lived. The next morning they woke to find that someone had tried to burn down the barn during the night. Ethan had heard the noise and managed to put out the fire before it spread, but the message was clear. Thornwood was escalating. "He knows," Willa said, as they surveyed the damage. "He knows we are behind the problems at his operations." "Maybe," Ethan said, "or maybe he is just getting impatient about you leaving." Either way, they both knew the situation had become more dangerous. That afternoon, they rode back into town to meet with James Harrison. They found him in his office, his face grim. "I heard about the fire," he said. "This has to stop, Mrs. Preston. Thornwood is going to kill someone." "He already has," Ethan said. "My brother. Probably Mr. Preston. Who knows how many others?" "But we cannot prove any of it," Harrison said. "And if you two keep pushing, you are going to end up dead as well." "So we just give up?" Willa demanded. "Let Thornwood win?" "I am saying we need to be smarter," Harrison said. He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer. "I have been doing some research. Thornwood's financial situation is not as solid as it appears. He has been borrowing heavily to fund his expansion, and several of his loans are coming due. If he were to suffer a significant setback, something that hurt him badly enough financially, he might be forced to sell off some of his holdings to cover his debts." Ethan leaned forward. "What kind of setback?" "His main processing facility," Harrison said. "It is where he refines the ore from all his mines before shipping it to Denver. If that facility were to shut down for any length of time, his whole operation would grind to a halt. He would not be able to meet his contracts, and he would lose a fortune." "How do we shut it down?" Willa asked. Harrison hesitated. "There is a problem. The facility is heavily guarded. Thornwood knows it is his most vulnerable point. You would never get close enough to do any damage." They sat in frustrated silence for a moment. Then Ethan said, "What if we did not have to get close? What if there was a way to shut it down from a distance?" "What are you thinking?" Willa asked. "The facility needs water," Ethan said. "For processing the ore, for cooling the machinery." "Where does it get that water?" Harrison's eyes widened. "There is a creek that runs down from the mountains. Thornwood diverted part of it to run through his facility. But if something were to happen to that diversion, to block the water flow, his whole operation would have to shut down until he could fix it," Ethan finished. "And if we made it look like a natural occurrence like a rock slide or a log jam, he could not even blame it on sabotage." They spent the rest of the day working out the details. The diversion was located about 3 miles upstream from Thornwood's facility, in a narrow canyon where the creek tumbled down from the high peaks. It would be dangerous work, but if they could create a convincing blockage, it could buy them weeks or even months of disruption. That night, Willa and Ethan rode out to scout the location. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see by, and the canyon was eerily beautiful in the silver glow. They tied their horses at the mouth of the canyon and hiked up the narrow trail beside the rushing water. "There," Ethan said, pointing to a spot where the canyon walls were steep and unstable. "If we could loosen those rocks, they would fall right into the creek. It would create a natural dam." "How do we loosen them?" Willa asked. "Carefully," Ethan said with a slight smile. "We would need to work over several nights, digging out the base, weakening the support. Then when we are ready, one good push should send the whole thing down." They started the next night. It was hard, dangerous work, made harder by the need to remain silent and unseen. They took turns keeping watch while the other worked, prying at rocks with crowbars and digging out the packed earth at their base. By the end of the first night, Willa's hands were blistered and her shoulders ached, but they had made good progress. Over the next 5 nights, they continued their work. They grew more confident, more efficient, and Willa found herself almost enjoying the challenge despite the risk. There was something deeply satisfying about working side by side with Ethan toward a common goal, about knowing that every rock they moved was another blow against the man who had caused them both so much pain. On the 6th night, they decided they were ready. The rock face was unstable, held in place by only a few key stones. Ethan rigged up a system using rope and a large log they had found upstream, creating a makeshift battering ram. When everything was in place, they both put their weight behind it and pushed. The first impact sent tremors through the rocks. The second produced a loud crack. On the third impact, the entire face began to move. Willa and Ethan scrambled back, as tons of rock crashed down into the creek bed with a roar that echoed through the canyon. Water sprayed up in a huge plume, and when it settled, they could see that the creek was completely blocked. Water was already beginning to pool behind the new dam. "We need to go," Ethan said, grabbing her hand. "That noise will have carried for miles." They ran back to where they had left the horses, mounted up, and rode hard back toward Willa's property. They did not stop until they were safely home, and even then they stood in the yard for a long time, listening for sounds of pursuit. But the night remained quiet except for the wind in the pines. "Do you think it worked?" Willa asked. "We will know soon enough," Ethan said. They did not have to wait long. By noon the next day, word had spread through Leadville that Marcus Thornwood's processing facility had shut down due to lack of water. Thornwood was reportedly furious, offering a large reward for information about the rock slide and insisting it had been deliberate sabotage. But the general consensus among the townsfolk was that it had been an act of nature, the kind of thing that happens sometimes in these mountains. Over the next week, the situation developed exactly as James Harrison had predicted. With his facility shut down, Thornwood could not process ore from any of his mines. He had to lay off workers and notify his customers that he could not fulfill his contracts. The financial pressure began to mount, and rumors started circulating that Thornwood was trying to sell some of his holdings to raise cash. But Thornwood was not a man who accepted defeat easily. On a cold October morning, 12 days after the rock slide, he came to Willa's property himself. She and Ethan were working on repairs to the barn when they heard the horses approaching. Willa counted 8 men, all armed, with Thornwood at their head. Marcus Thornwood was a large man, barrel-chested and imposing, with iron-gray hair and cold blue eyes. He dismounted and walked toward them with the confidence of someone who was used to getting his way. "Mrs. Preston," he said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "We need to talk." "I have nothing to say to you," Willa replied. She was aware of Ethan moving slightly to position himself between her and Thornwood's men. "I think you do," Thornwood said. His gaze moved to Ethan, assessing. "You must be the cowboy who has been staying here. Ortega, is it? Miguel Ortega's brother?" "That is right," Ethan said evenly. "Your brother was a troublemaker," Thornwood said. "Always complaining, always trying to stir up the other workers. I was not sorry when that shaft collapsed." Willa saw Ethan's hand move toward his gun, but she touched his arm, stopping him. Thornwood had 8 men with him. Starting a gunfight now would be suicide. Thornwood seemed to sense the dynamics. He smiled, though the expression did not reach his eyes. "Smart woman. Now, here is how this is going to work, Mrs. Preston. You are going to sell me your land at a fair price. I will even be generous, give you enough to start over somewhere else, and your cowboy friend here is going to ride out of town and never come back. If you both do this, we can all walk away without anyone getting hurt." "And if we refuse?" Willa asked. "Then I stop being nice," Thornwood said. His voice dropped, losing all pretense of friendliness. "I own this town, Mrs. Preston. I own the sheriff. I own the judge. I own half the businesses on Harrison Avenue. If I want you gone, you are gone. The only question is whether you leave on your own 2 feet or in a pine box." "You killed my brother," Ethan said quietly. "I did not kill anyone," Thornwood replied. "Mining is dangerous work. Accidents happen. And if Miguel Ortega was not happy with the conditions at my mine, he should have quit instead of trying to organize a rebellion." He turned back to Willa. "I will give you 3 days to make your decision. After that, the offer expires, and we do things the hard way." He remounted his horse and rode off with his men following. Willa and Ethan stood in the yard, watching until they were out of sight. "He is going to kill us," Willa said. "Not if we kill him first," Ethan replied. She turned to stare at him. "What?" "I am not talking about murder," Ethan said quickly. "But if we could prove that Thornwood was responsible for Miguel's death, for the unsafe conditions in his mines, maybe even for Daniel's death, we could have him arrested." At the very least, it would ruin his reputation and his business. How do we prove any of that? Willa asked. We need someone who worked in those mines, Ethan said. Someone who knows what really happened and is willing to testify. That evening, they met again with James Harrison. He listened to their account of Thornwood's visit, his expression growing increasingly troubled. He is desperate, Harrison said finally. The shutdown of his processing facility has hurt him worse than we thought, but that also makes him more dangerous. We need witnesses, Ethan said. People who worked in Thornwood's mines and can testify about the unsafe conditions. Harrison shook his head. Most of the miners are too scared. Thornwood has made examples of people who spoke out against him before. There has to be someone, Willa insisted. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, There might be one man. His name is Frank Collier. He was the shift foreman at the Silverbell mine when Miguel and the others died. He quit right after the collapse, said he could not work for Thornwood anymore. Last I heard, he was living up at a cabin north of town, trying to drink himself to death. Can we talk to him? Ethan asked. You can try, Harrison said. But I warn you, Frank is a broken man. What he saw in that mine broke something in him. They rode out the next morning, following Harrison's directions to a ramshackle cabin in a clearing about 6 miles north of Leadville. The place looked abandoned at first, but as they approached, they saw a thin stream of smoke coming from the chimney. Ethan knocked on the door. There was a long silence, then a voice called out, Go away. Mr. Collier? My name is Ethan Ortega. Miguel Ortega was my brother. I need to talk to you about what happened at the Silverbell mine. There was another silence, longer this time. Then the door opened a crack. The man who peered out at them was in his 50s, with graying hair and a face that looked like it had aged decades in a matter of months. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. Miguel Ortega, he repeated. I remember Miguel. Good man. He tried to warn me, but I did not listen. Can we come in? Willa asked gently. Collier studied them for a moment, then opened the door wider. The cabin was dark and smelled of whiskey and unwashed clothes. Collier gestured vaguely at a couple of rickety chairs and then sat down heavily on his bed. What do you want to know? He asked. Everything, Ethan said. I want to know exactly what happened the day my brother died. Collier reached for a bottle on the floor beside his bed, took a long swallow, and began to talk. As he spoke, the full horror of what had happened became clear. Thornwood had known the shaft was unstable. He had received reports from multiple people, including Collier and Miguel, warning that the support beams were inadequate and the rock overhead was fractured. But Thornwood had ordered them to continue working anyway, driven by greed and the pressure of his debts. He had even threatened to fire anyone who refused. On the day of the collapse, Miguel had been down in the shaft with 4 other men. Collier had been supervising from above. He had heard the first crack, had shouted for the men to get out, but it was too late. The entire roof of the shaft had come down in a matter of seconds. It had taken 3 days to dig out the bodies. I should have stood up to him, Collier said, his voice breaking. I should have refused to send those men down there, but I was scared of losing my job, scared of what Thornwood would do, and because I was a coward, 5 good men died. It was not your fault, Willa said. Thornwood is the one who made that choice. I could have stopped it, Collier insisted. He looked at Ethan with desperate eyes. I am sorry about your brother. He was one of the brave ones trying to make things right. Will you testify against Thornwood? Ethan asked. Will you tell the authorities what you just told us? Collier laughed bitterly. The authorities? Thornwood owns the local sheriff. Even if we went to the territorial marshal, it would be my word against his, and I am just a drunk foreman with a grudge. What if you were not the only witness? Willa asked. What if other people came forward, people who could corroborate your story? There are no other people, Collier said. Everyone who knew the truth is either dead or too scared to talk. Not everyone, Ethan said slowly. Thornwood must have records, documents showing that he was warned about the unsafe conditions. If we could get our hands on those, Collier looked up sharply. He keeps all his important papers in a safe in his office. I used to have to deliver reports there, but there is no way you could get into that office. He has guards around the clock. Maybe not during the day, Ethan said, but at night? Over the next 2 days, they planned what they knew was their most dangerous move yet. Thornwood's office was on the second floor of a building he owned on Harrison Avenue, above a saloon called the Lucky Strike. Getting in would require climbing up from the back alley, breaking through a window, and cracking the safe without being heard by the guards patrolling downstairs. I will do it, Ethan said. You stay here where it is safe. Absolutely not, Willa said. We are in this together. Willa, if something goes wrong, if I get caught, then we both get caught, she interrupted. I am not letting you take this risk alone, Ethan. I have as much reason as you do to want Thornwood brought down. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the struggle in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. All right, but you do exactly what I say, when I say it. Agreed? Agreed. They chose a moonless night for the attempt. Dressed in dark clothes, they made their way through the back alleys of Leadville until they reached the building housing Thornwood's office. The Lucky Strike was busy, light and noise spilling out onto the street, but the back alley was dark and quiet. Ethan had brought rope and a grappling hook. On his third try, he managed to hook it onto the window ledge of Thornwood's office. He tested the rope, then looked at Willa. I will go up first. Once I am in, I will throw the rope back down for you. She watched as he climbed, hand over hand, moving with the easy strength of someone who had spent years working cattle. He reached the window, worked at it for a moment, and then disappeared inside. A few seconds later, the rope came snaking back down. Willa grabbed it and started to climb. It was harder than she had expected, her arms burning with the effort, but she forced herself to keep moving. Ethan's hand appeared, reaching down to help her over the window ledge, and then she was inside. The office was dark except for a sliver of moonlight coming through the window. Willa could make out a large desk, file cabinets along one wall, and in the corner, a heavy iron safe. Ethan moved to the safe and knelt beside it, pressing his ear against the door. Willa knew he had some experience with safes from his cattle drive days when he had occasionally worked as a ranch foreman and needed access to payroll funds. She watched as his fingers worked the dial, moving slowly and carefully. It took nearly 20 minutes, but finally she heard a soft click. Ethan pulled open the safe door and began pulling out papers. Willa moved to the window to keep watch on the alley below, while Ethan sorted through the documents by matchlight. Found it, he whispered. Reports about unsafe conditions in multiple mines, all ignored. Letters from investors threatening to pull out if safety did not improve. And this, he held up a ledger. This shows that Thornwood has been borrowing from some very dangerous people in Denver. He is in debt to the tune of $50,000. Take it all, Willa whispered back. We need as much evidence as we can carry. Ethan was stuffing papers into a leather satchel he had brought when they heard footsteps on the stairs outside the office door. They both froze. The footsteps stopped right outside, and they heard the rattle of keys. Out the window, Ethan hissed. And now. Willa did not argue. She climbed out onto the ledge as Ethan grabbed the satchel and followed her. They could hear the door opening as Ethan pulled the window mostly closed behind them. They pressed themselves flat against the wall, not daring to move or breathe. Through the gap in the window, they could hear someone moving around inside the office. Then a voice called out, "Mr. Thornwood." The door was unlocked. "Did you forget to lock it when you left?" There was a pause, then another voice, this one deeper and unmistakably Marcus Thornwood's. "I locked it. Someone has been in here." Willa felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it from inside. She looked at Ethan, who was motioning toward the rope still hanging from the window ledge. But if they tried to climb down now, they would be heard immediately. "Check the safe," Thornwood ordered. They heard footsteps crossing the room, then a curse. "It has been opened. Papers are missing." "Find them!" Thornwood roared. "Search the building. Search the street." Whoever did this could not have gotten far. They heard running footsteps, voices shouting below. Ethan grabbed the rope and threw it down, then took Willa's hand. "When we hit the ground, we run. Do not look back. Do not stop. Head for the river." They slid down the rope, Willa going first with Ethan right behind her. The moment her feet touched the ground, they heard shouts from inside the building. They ran, sprinting through the dark alley, the satchel of documents bouncing against Ethan's side. Behind them, they could hear men pouring out of the building, voices yelling for them to stop. A gunshot rang out, the bullet sparking off the brick wall beside Willa's head. Ethan pulled her around a corner, and they kept running, weaving through alleys and back streets, using every bit of cover they could find. They reached the Arkansas River, which ran through the southern edge of town. Without hesitating, they plunged into the icy water. It was only about waist deep at this time of year, but the current was strong and the cold was shocking. They waded across to the far side, their pursuers still visible on the street behind them, searching for where they had gone. Once across, they climbed out and ran into the forest on the far side, not stopping until they were deep enough in the trees that they could no longer see the lights of town. Only then did they collapse against a large pine, both of them gasping for breath, soaked and shivering. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked. "I am fine," Willa managed. "Did we lose them?" "For now, but Thornwood knows someone took those documents. He will be looking everywhere." He held up the satchel. "At least it is waterproof." They made their way through the forest, moving parallel to the road, but staying hidden in the trees. It took them nearly 3 hours to reach Willa's property, both of them exhausted and half frozen. They dried off and changed clothes, then sat by the fire examining their haul. The documents were even more damning than they had hoped. In addition to the safety reports and financial records, there were letters proving that Thornwood had bribed local officials, including the sheriff. There was also evidence that he had deliberately ordered work to continue in the Silver Bell mine despite knowing the danger, because shutting it down would have cost him time and money he could not afford to lose. "This is enough," Willa said. "This is enough to bring him down." "We need to get it to the territorial marshal in Denver," Ethan said, "and we need Frank Collier to testify about what he saw." They set out at dawn, riding hard for Frank Collier's cabin, but when they arrived, they found the door standing open and Collier lying on the floor, unconscious but alive. He had been beaten badly, his face bloody and swollen. Willa knelt beside him while Ethan went for water. "Frank, can you hear me?" Collier's eyes fluttered open. "Thornwood," he mumbled through split lips. "His men came last night. Asked if I had talked to anyone. I told them no, but they did not believe me." "We are getting you to a doctor," Willa said. "No time," Collier said. He grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "You have to go. Thornwood knows. He knows someone is building a case against him. He is going to move against you with everything he has." "Let him come," Ethan said grimly. "We have what we need to destroy him." But Collier shook his head. "You do not understand. Thornwood sent word to Denver, called in markers with some very dangerous men. There are hired killers coming to Leadville, professional gunmen. You cannot fight them." Willa and Ethan exchanged glances. "How long do we have?" Ethan asked. "They were supposed to arrive today," Collier said. "Maybe they are already here." Ethan helped Collier to his feet. "We are all leaving. Right now. We ride to Denver, turn over the documents to the marshal, and get Frank to a doctor. Once Thornwood is arrested, those hired killers will have no reason to come after us." They rode out within the hour, taking the main road that wound through the mountains toward Denver. It was a 2-day journey under normal circumstances, but they pushed hard. hoping to make it in less. Collier, despite his injuries, managed to stay on his horse, driven by the same determination that was pushing them all. They had been riding for about 3 hours when Ethan suddenly held up his hand, signaling them to stop. "Listen," he said. Willa heard it then, the sound of multiple horses behind them moving fast. She looked at Ethan, fear tight in her chest. "They are coming," he said. "We need to get off the road." They turned their horses and plunged into the forest, riding through the trees as fast as they dared. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Willa could hear men shouting, coordinating their search. "There," Ethan said, pointing to a rocky outcropping ahead. "We can make a stand there." They dismounted and led their horses behind the rocks, then took up positions with their rifles. Willa's hands were shaking as she loaded her weapon, but she forced herself to focus. She thought about Scout, about Daniel, about Miguel, about all the people Thornwood had hurt or killed in his pursuit of wealth and power. If they were going to die here, at least they would die fighting back. The riders came into view, 6 men, all heavily armed, fanning out as they searched the forest. Willa recognized one of them from Thornwood's visit to her property. These were not just hired guns. These were killers. Ethan fired first, his shot taking one of the men out of the saddle. The others immediately returned fire, bullets pinging off the rocks around them. Willa aimed carefully and squeezed the trigger, feeling the rifle kick against her shoulder. She saw another man fall. The battle was fierce but brief. The hired guns had numbers, but Ethan, Willa, and even wounded Frank Collier had position and cover. After losing 2 men and with 2 more wounded, the remaining gunmen retreated, disappearing back through the trees. "They will be back," Ethan said, reloading his rifle. "Probably with more men. We need to keep moving." But before they could mount up, they heard more horses approaching, this time from the direction of Denver. Willa felt despair wash over her. They were trapped, caught between 2 groups of enemies. But then she saw the lead rider, and her heart leaped. It was James Harrison, and he was leading what looked like 20 men, all armed. Behind them rode several official-looking men in suits. Harrison reined in his horse, looking down at them with a broad smile. "Mrs. Preston, Mr. Ortega, I believe you might need some help." One of the men in suits dismounted. He was middle-aged, with a neat mustache and sharp eyes. "I am Marshal Henry Dawson," he said. "Mr. Harrison came to Denver yesterday with some very interesting allegations about Marcus Thornwood. When he told me you were riding to Denver with evidence, I decided we should meet you halfway. It looks like we arrived just in time." Ethan handed over the satchel of documents. "It is all in there, Marshal. Proof that Thornwood has been operating unsafe mines, bribing officials, and engaging in what amounts to criminal negligence that has resulted in multiple deaths." Dawson opened the satchel and began looking through the papers. His expression grew increasingly grim. "This is serious. This is very serious. I will need witness testimony as well." "I will testify," Frank Collier said, stepping forward despite his injuries. "I will tell you everything I know about what happened at the Silver Bell mine and other Thornwood operations." "So will I," Harrison added. "I have been documenting Thornwood's illegal activities for months. I have statements from other miners who are willing to come forward now that they know there is real protection." Marshal Dawson nodded. "All right, we are going back to Leadville. I am placing Marcus Thornwood under arrest." They rode back to Leadville as a group, the marshal's men providing protection. As they entered the town, Willa saw people stopping to stare, word spreading quickly about what was happening. By the time they reached Thornwood's office building, a crowd had gathered. Thornwood was in his office, surrounded by several of his men. When Marshal Dawson and his deputies climbed the stairs, weapons drawn, there was a tense moment when it looked like there might be gunfire. But Thornwood was smart enough to know when he was beaten. He allowed himself to be arrested, his face a mask of fury as the marshal read out the charges. As they led Thornwood out of the building, he caught sight of Willa and Ethan standing in the crowd. "This is not over," he said. "I have lawyers. I have friends in high places. You have not one." "Actually, we have," Ethan said quietly. Your hired guns are scattered or dead. Your financial backers will abandon you the moment they hear about these charges. And everyone in this town now knows what you really are. Thornwood was taken away to the local jail, where he would be held until he could be transported to Denver to face trial. Marshal Dawson assured Willa and Ethan that with the evidence they had provided and the testimony of Collier and Harrison, conviction was all but certain. Over the next few weeks, the case against Thornwood grew stronger. More miners came forward with stories of unsafe working conditions and intimidation. Investigators found evidence of additional crimes, including fraud and theft. Thornwood's financial empire began to crumble as investors pulled out and creditors demanded payment. Willa and Ethan spent that time at her property, rebuilding the barn that had been partially burned and preparing for the coming winter. They also spent time simply being together, learning each other's rhythms and dreams, building the foundation for the life they wanted to create. One evening in late November, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Ethan took Willa's hand and led her to the small rise behind the house where Scout was buried. He had been working on something in secret, and now she saw what it was. A beautiful wooden cross he had carved with Scout's name and the simple inscription, "Faithful Companion." Tears filled Willa's eyes as she looked at it. "It is perfect," she said. "Scout deserved to be remembered," Ethan said. "He tried to protect you, and in a way, his death brought us together." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Willa Preston, I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to spend the rest of my days with you, building a life here, making this place into a real home. Will you marry me?" Willa felt joy bubbling up inside her, bright and overwhelming. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, Ethan Ortega." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and she kissed him back with all the love and hope and fierce determination she felt. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling, snow catching in their hair and eyelashes. They were married in early December in a small ceremony at the church in Leadville, with James Harrison and Frank Collier serving as witnesses. Willa wore a simple blue dress, and Ethan looked handsome in a new suit. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Willa felt like her life was finally beginning again after 2 years of grief and struggle. Thornwood's trial took place in Denver in January 1883. Ethan and Willa both testified, as did Collier and Harrison and a dozen other witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus Thornwood was found guilty on multiple charges, including manslaughter, fraud, and bribery. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. With Thornwood gone, Leadville began to change. The Harrison Mining Cooperative expanded, implementing strict safety standards that became a model for other operations. Other mine owners, seeing which way the wind was blowing, began improving conditions for their workers. The town was still rough and sometimes dangerous, but it was becoming more civilized, more like a real community. Willa and Ethan settled into married life with an ease that sometimes surprised them both. Ethan proved to be as good a rancher as he had been a cowboy, and they began building up a small herd of cattle on Willa's property. The income from the mining rights on her land continued to provide a solid financial foundation, and between the two sources of revenue, they were able to live comfortably. In the spring of 1883, Willa discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy, tempered by nervousness, but when their son was born in November of that year, a healthy baby with Ethan's gray-green eyes and Willa's determined spirit, they named him Miguel Daniel, honoring both the brother and husband they had lost. Life was not always easy. The winters at 10,000 feet were brutal, and there were always challenges with the cattle, the weather, and the slowly evolving politics of Leadville. But Willa and Ethan faced each obstacle together, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating together during the good ones. In 1885, their daughter was born, a beautiful girl they named Rose Elena. 2 years later, another son arrived, whom they named James Frank, after James Harrison and Frank Collier, both of whom had become dear friends and regular visitors to the ranch. Frank Collier, freed from the guilt and fear that had nearly destroyed him, gave up drinking and became an advocate for mine safety throughout Colorado. He never did go back to working in the mines, but he traveled extensively, giving talks and helping to organize workers. He became something of a legend in mining communities, the foreman who had helped bring down one of the territory's most corrupt operators. James Harrison's cooperative continued to thrive, and Harrison himself eventually went into politics, elected to the territorial legislature where he fought for worker protections and safety regulations. He credited Willa and Ethan with inspiring him to take a more active role in reform, saying that their courage in standing up to Thornwood had shown him what was possible when good people refused to be intimidated. As for Willa and Ethan, they built the life they had dreamed of. The ranch prospered, growing to encompass several hundred acres and a substantial cattle herd. They added on to the house, transforming it from a modest cabin into a comfortable family home. They became respected members of the Leadville community, known for their fairness, their generosity, and their willingness to help neighbors in need. On warm summer evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch their children play in the yard, the mountains rising majestically in the distance. Sometimes they would talk about how they had met, about Scout and Miguel and Daniel, about Thornwood and that terrifying night breaking into his office. But mostly they talked about the future, about their plans and their dreams, about the life they were building together day by day. "Do you ever regret it?" Willa asked one evening in the summer of 1890, as they sat watching the sun set behind the peaks. 7 years of marriage had only deepened their love, adding layers of shared experience and understanding. "Coming to Leadville? Getting involved in all that danger?" Ethan took her hand, his thumb tracing familiar patterns on her palm. "I regret that Miguel died. I regret all the suffering Thornwood caused. But do I regret meeting you? Never. Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Willa." "You saved my life," she said. "Not just from Thornwood, but from the loneliness and fear I was drowning in after Daniel died. You made me believe I could be strong again, that I could build a new life." "We saved each other," Ethan said. He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and pine and home. "And we built this life together. Everything good we have, we made it as partners." In the house behind them, they could hear their children laughing, the ordinary sounds of a happy home. Miguel was 7 now, already showing signs of being as thoughtful and determined as the uncle he was named for. Rose was 5, with her mother's fierce independence and her father's quiet confidence. Little James was 3, still a toddler, but already displaying a curiosity about everything around him. "I want to grow old with you," Willa said softly. "I want to watch our children grow up and have children of their own. I want to sit on this porch when we are gray and bent and remember everything we went through to get here." "Then that is exactly what we will do," Ethan promised. He tilted her face up and kissed her, gentle and sweet, a kiss that spoke of years of love and the promise of years more to come. As darkness fell over the Colorado mountains and the first stars appeared in the vast sky above, Willa and Ethan Ortega sat together in the home they had fought for and built together, surrounded by the family they had created, living proof that love and courage could triumph even in the wild and dangerous world of the frontier. The town of Leadville continued to grow and change around them. The silver boom eventually faded, but the town adapted, finding new sources of income and new reasons for people to stay. The rough edges softened with time, though it never entirely lost its frontier character. Schools were built, churches established, and the rule of law became more firmly established. Marcus Thornwood served 12 years of his sentence before dying in prison in 1895. When news of his death reached Leadville, there was little mourning. He had been a man who had used power and wealth to hurt others, and while his passing marked the end of an era, it was an era few people look back on with nostalgia. As the years passed, Willa and Ethan became elder statesmen of sorts in the community. People came to them for advice, for mediation in disputes, and sometimes just for the reassurance that came from talking to two people who had weathered so many storms and emerged stronger for it. They never forgot where they had come from or what they had fought for, and they instilled those same values in their children. Miguel grew up to become a lawyer, dedicating his practice to representing workers and families who had been wronged by powerful interests. Rose became a teacher, opening a school for the children of miners and ranch families. James followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a rancher and eventually taking over the management of the family operation. All three children married and had families of their own, and Willa and Ethan's house was frequently filled with grandchildren, their laughter echoing through the rooms and spilling out into the mountain air. On winter evenings, the whole family would gather around the fireplace, and Ethan would tell stories about the old days, about cattle drives and mining towns, and the time their grandmother had refused to back down from the most powerful man in Colorado. Grandma was brave, the children would say, looking at Willa with awe. Grandma was terrified, Willa would correct them with a smile. But being brave does not mean not being scared. It means doing what is right even when you are scared. Grandpa was brave too, Ethan would add, squeezing her hand. The bravest person I ever met. We were brave together, Willa would say. That is what made the difference. In the spring of 1910, Willa and Ethan celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary. They took a trip to Denver, staying in a fine hotel and marveling at how much the city had grown since they had last visited together. They went to the opera, dined in restaurants, and walked through parks, enjoying the simple pleasure of being together without the demands of the ranch or family. On their last evening in Denver, they returned to the courthouse where Thornwood had been tried all those years ago. The building was still there, though it looked smaller and less imposing than Willa remembered. They stood outside for a while, hand in hand, remembering. We were so young, Willa said. I was 24. You were 26. We thought we knew everything. We knew enough, Ethan said. We knew what mattered. Yes, Willa agreed. We did. They returned to Leadville and their ranch, to the life they had built, and the family that surrounded them. The mountains still rose majestically around them, eternal and unchanging, while everything else evolved and grew. In the summer of 1918, as America was embroiled in the Great War and the world seemed to be changing faster than ever, Willa and Ethan sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. They were older now, their hair white and their movements slower, but the love between them burned as bright as ever. 62 years old, Willa said, shaking her head in wonder. When I was a girl, I never imagined living this long, experiencing this much. 64, Ethan corrected. And I plan to stick around quite a bit longer. We have great-grandchildren to meet, remember? Yes, Willa said, smiling. Their granddaughter had married the previous year and was expecting her first child in the fall. The cycle of life continued, each generation building on the foundation laid by those who came before. Do you remember the day we met? Ethan asked. You were standing in your yard, covered in dirt from burying Scout, looking like you wanted to shoot someone. I remember thinking you were either very brave or very foolish, riding up to a woman holding a rifle, Willa said. I still have not decided which. Maybe both, Ethan said with a laugh. But I am glad I did. That moment changed my whole life. Mine too, Willa said. She reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. Everything good in my life came from that day. You, our children, this home, all of it. I love you, Willa Ortega, Ethan said. I loved you then, I love you now, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Willa said, always and forever. They sat together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple, two people who had found each other in the midst of darkness and built a life filled with light. Their story had begun with violence and loss, but it had become something beautiful, a testament to the power of love and courage and the determination to stand up for what is right. The ranch they had built would continue for generations, passed down through their family, each new generation adding their own chapter to the story. But it all began on that September morning in 1882 when a widow found her dog murdered and a cowboy rode into her yard and changed everything. From that tragedy had grown something lasting and true, a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger each time. They had faced down corruption and violence, had fought for justice and won, had built a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Willa and Ethan rose from their chairs and walked inside together, ready to face whatever the next day might bring, secure in the knowledge that they would face it side by side, the way they had faced every challenge for the past 36 years. Their story had a beginning, a middle filled with struggle and triumph and joy, and someday it would have an ending, but not yet. Not while there were still sunsets to watch, grandchildren to hold, and years of love still to be lived. The cowboy and the widow who had taken on a corrupt empire, and one had found something even more valuable than justice or land or silver. They had found each other, and in doing so, had found home.